Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the ATACS podcast. We are adults talking about cool stuff, and we are here today to talk about Resident Evil 4. I think I got that right.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
You nailed it.
The date today is August 3rd, 2013. I am your host today. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. Joining me on this, I was about to say survival horror, but is Resident Evil 4 that spooky? I don't know. Anyway, joining me for this discussion is Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
It's going. Did they do the creepy narrator voice for this remake? I don't.
They
remember.
did not, and that's why it's a bad remake.
Bad game.
And also joining us is Will from Wendell, North Carolina.
That's it. Here I am.
And yes, we're talking about specifically Resident Evil 4 Remake because the original Resident Evil 4 does give the great Resident Evil 4 narration voice. The remake does not. We are talking about the 2023 remake. And this is a deep dive discussion, so anything is on the table, a spoiler cast, if you will. So if you are averse to any spoilers for the Resident Evil 4 remake, this is your one warning to leave now. And being a remake, it's hopefully obvious, but just in case it isn't, I will also state that the original Resident Evil 4 is on the table for spoilers because it's pretty unavoidable. So both the remake and the original will be spoiled here. And given that, I think the pertinent first question here is, what is everyone's experience with the original Resident Evil 4? We have all played the remake this year. I think we all played the remake on PlayStation 5. Is that correct me if...
That's correct for me.
All right. All three of us played the remake on PlayStation 5. And what is everyone's experience with the original Resident Evil 4 before we dive headfirst into the remake? Nate, you want to start us off?
Sure. Played the original back in the GameCube days. Liked it a lot. I think you and I both played that game many times through. You probably more than me. Yeah, I think that's one of those games that was a big deal for third-person action games in this style, and I definitely liked it a lot. And thought, I guess you were only asking about the original, but I'll say I thought the remake was a good update of that.
Yeah. And you, Nate, you also played. Did you also play the Wii version?
I think I did try it, but I don't think I played the whole thing through on the Wii.
Okay.
I tried it and was like, this is neat, you point with the Wiimote, and then never actually played all the way through it. If I did play all the way through it, it's not in my memory anywhere.
Fair enough. What about you, Mr. Will?
So I played the original Resident Evil 4 one time on GameCube, and it wasn't my GameCube. And so it was kind of a big fell swoop. Like I played it all very like over the course of a couple days. And yeah, I would concur with Nate when he talks about the idea of that being a big turning point. I think as soon as it came out, there were a lot of games that started adopting this kind of action oriented third person angle. Most notably 2008's Dead Space, I guess, tried to kind of pick up where this game left off in a way, although maybe quite a little bit different setting and a little bit different style. But that's my experience. So it's very rusty, my knowledge of the original Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, that's quite all right. And yeah, it is worth noting that like Resident Evil 4 was when it came out in 2005, originally on the GameCube, since been ported to basically everything. It was a very like quote unquote important game, that it had a big impact on the industry. Will mentioned Dead Space. Also, at least as famously, the developers of Gears of War cited Resident Evil 4 as a huge influence, which you could almost trace that and argue there's an argument to be made that the entire half dozen years of cover-based shooters was directly due to Resident Evil 4's influence. Third-person cover-based shooters. Even developers at Naughty Dog on The Last of Us cited Resident Evil 4 as a big influence. So its influence stretches pretty deep. For a solid decade after it came out, a lot of games kind of following in that mold. And yeah, I also played it when it came out, the GameCube version. Played the GameCube version at least 2 or 3 times. Played the Wii version, and played it on PC a couple years ago. Just had the urge to pick it back up. So I've probably played through the original at least 4 or 5 times, including all the bonus content like Separate Ways and Mercenaries and all that stuff. I think that's really all there's about to say. All there's to say for the original up front. It is one of my favorite games of all time.
You should probably just say like, this is one of your favorite games ever, right? Like,
yeah, that should be put on the table. This is one of the games I'm just on the short list of games that on the right day I would call my favorite game ever made.
Right.
It is.
It reaches that level for me, but yeah, it's one of those very influential games that I really liked at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Resident Evil 4 is a very good video game, and Capcom done decided to remake it in the year 2023, which they've been building towards this for a while because they remade Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 in the past few years. And of course it was like, oh, the big one, Resident Evil 4, when's, when that comes, that's going to be huge, which you could argue that maybe Resident Evil 4 didn't need a remake as much. It's still very playable today. But we did get a remake. And
so we might as well talk about it.
Yes. And they did, to their credit, which I think a 100% faithful remake probably would have felt a little less meaningful. I don't know if you guys disagree, but they did take some creative liberties with the remake, and that's probably a lot of what we're going to be talking through. Is it is in my opinion, a fairly substantial game. It contains a lot of the same general structure. You are playing as Leon, trying to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley, who's been taken by this cultist group to somewhere in Spain, and the Las Plagas is still a thing, and Ramon Salazar is still a person that you have to interact with and see. That glorious man.
Ramon.
And yeah, it's still a third-person shooter, and a lot of the weapons are the same names. A lot of the locations are very similar and recognizable. A lot of the bones are still the same, but they've changed a lot of stuff around the periphery. So maybe with that, maybe we'll start with one of you kind of commented on it at the start before we got started when we were prepping I think it was you, Will, commented that, or maybe it was Nate, that the knife in the original didn't have durability. So perhaps one of the biggest updates in this game is they've added a lot of stuff around the knife. So maybe one of the first discussion questions about the remake is, with everything around the knife, how did you guys like that stuff? So the knife can now, in the original, the knife didn't have durability, and it was always on its own dedicated button you could slash with. Now the knife does have durability, but also has more functionality. You can counter attacks, you can parry, you can get stealth attack. If you involve stealth, you can get an instant kill if you stealth up on enemies, all that kind of stuff. How did you guys like all of the interactions available with the knife as kind of like an added, kind of like a whole new added layer to the game? You want to start us off here, Will?
Sure. One of my biggest, I guess, memories of, I think, watching you play this, because I actually watched you play this one of the times. Not a lot of it, but I do remember watching you play. I guess it was the old either GameCube version or something like that. But I remember there was this sort of rhythm that you got into with the combat, and it was kind of cool watching you, because you were kind of at least to my eyes, you were kind of like a virtuoso. You know, you had this sort of rhythm where you'd like shoot a guy in the knee, he would stagger downwards, and then you'd run up and like roundhouse kick him or something like that, or you'd shoot a guy in the shoe and then suplex him or something like that. I remember watching you do this and thinking that it was like such a cool display, you know? So, I don't know. I guess for some reason that was actually a stronger memory for me than playing the game myself. So it's hard for me to really remember what it was like when I had the original knife in the original game. I will say that I do like stealth as a general rule, so I did use a lot of the sneak up insta kill situation. Every once in a while, I would do the sort of parry counter type stuff, but that was really only when I never, and maybe this is the nature of a parry or a counter, but I certainly never wanted to use that functionality. It was always like, I'm now in a bad position. I'm going to need to not get, thwart. So let me, hit this little, I guess it was like L1 or something that did that. I can't quite recall. But yeah, I remember trying to counter moves like that. But I mean, I was always excited to get one of these like boot knives, I think they were called. Like you'd find a boot knife everywhere. And I was always kind of excited to grab one, because it usually meant for me that I think I spent a lot of the time using it, either one, on the stealth kills, or two, it's also a way to instantly get one of the Ganados to drop Ashley. And if you shot, there was always a chance you'd shoot her. But for some reason, if you walked up behind the guy who was carrying her away and then did the knife attack, you'd get him, and then he would drop Ashley. And then I was like, okay, well, that feels safe. So I'd say that's what I spent most of my time with knives doing, is stealth kills and getting someone to drop Ashley. That was what I spent my time doing.
It's really funny them grabbing Ashley and slinging her over their shoulder and like super slow walking towards an exit while she screams for you, because there's some points in the game where enemies literally just pay no attention to you, and they are set to just run straight for her and try to drag her to an exit, and you're supposed to stop them. And so in those sections, I would do what you were talking about, and I actually got to a point where when I noticed that they were just running past me, I would be like, yeah, go pick her up, that's fine. And I would just stand there, and then they would slow walk, and I was just like, stab. Okay, who's next? Come get her. And then,
come get her. She's my little bait.
Because they just completely ignore you in some of those sections.
Yeah, that's funny.
That's pretty great. Yeah.
But yeah.
Go ahead, Will.
No, that was most of what I remember about it.
Yeah. How did you find and there's a lot of the thing about this game, and I didn't really give much intro to the game overall. Like, I think I kind of assume Resident Evil 4 is fairly well-known territory at this point as a third-person action shooter. You're fighting a lot of not zombie enemies. They kind of act like zombies, but they're not technically zombies, and you're going through this kind of 3-act adventure. So I didn't really spend a lot of time setting the game up, but there are a lot of interlocking systems, because even in just talking about the knife, Ashley came up, which is kind of like it's a whole other topic we can get into. But So we're probably going to end up interlacing a lot of these topics. But Nate, how did you feel about like all of the knife behavior in this game, which is a pretty big aspect of the combat in this game?
Yeah, especially if you're comparing it to the original, it's a much bigger thing to think about and manage, but it worked for me fine. Like, you have a lot more options of what you can do with the knife in this game versus the original, but then you have that, like, I guess the quote unquote survival horror aspect of it, of constantly worrying about managing your resources and like when to use it. But I just decided that I was just going to use the knife. I had it, and I had an opportunity to use it, and that never came back to bite me in this game, which I was fine with. I always had knives when I needed them, so
Yeah,
I just used them.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, did you ever find yourself without knives?
Maybe
Like,
once.
when you really wanted it?
Yeah, maybe once. It wasn't often.
Yeah, and like I just used them all the time. I used them for parries. I used them for stealth kills, to defend myself if somebody grabbed me, like whatever. The one thing I did do was upgrade your like main combat knife as fast as I could, because that seemed to help. Just make sure I always had like a good option in any situation, and then I would just repair it when it broke, which was probably like if you're like charting out like an optimal playthrough, probably a waste of resources to just keep repairing the knife, but I felt fine about it.
No, I mean, I've not done an optimal playthrough, but my gut experience is, yeah, it's fine. Because I don't know, I feel like it's always important to have a knife, and yeah, I also, once I had the option to upgrade the durability specifically, the other stats maybe not as important, but specifically the durability on the combat knife, I did that as soon as I could.
And there was one briefcase charm that made knife repairs cheaper that I had on the whole game.
Wow. So you really went ham on it. That's awesome.
I was just Knife City.
Yeah, I don't think I ever did any upgrades for the knife.
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of times it seems pretty difficult to do the stealth kills. And then even if I did the stealth kill, it seemed like I could do maybe 3 of them before it would break a knife. I don't know. But yeah, that's cool that you guys were in here just stabbing it up, you know?
Yeah. I honestly didn't even use stealth that much, but there's so many uses for the knife. Like there's, and I don't even know that I parried. I mean, I parried when the opportunity presented itself, but like, I feel like a lot of my durability on knives got used when I got grabbed, and it would be like a get off me thing. And then also if you shoot enemies down on the ground and they start like kind of wriggling about because they're gonna turn into the various Las Plagas enemies, which are really not good to fight and use up a lot of ammo if you have to fight them. So that was probably actually the number one thing where, like, oh, if there was an opportunity to stab something writhing on the ground, I was going to do it.
Yeah, so like anytime an enemy was on the ground, I would stab it with a knife, and I actually was wondering at some point during the game, I was like, I should probably just let them do that and see what happens. But I assume they would just get up as a bad version of an enemy.
Yes, they do.
So yeah, I just was always stabbing them if they were on the ground.
Yeah. And I definitely had times where I ran out of knife durability and knives, and so I would have to I had no other choice other than to let them get up. Because definitely for the first chunk of the game, I was trying to play this game like the original Resident Evil 4, so that loop Will was kind of alluding to earlier of stagger the enemy, do a melee, and then knife them while they're on the ground, which was how I played Resident Evil 4 and how I understand it. A lot of, like, that was a fairly common way to play that game. I started the remake trying to play it that way, and given that knives have durability, it's not really an option anymore. So I did run out of knife durability a lot, especially early on when I was trying to play that way and before I had upgraded my combat knife. But I definitely adjusted my play through the course of the game as I learned how, like, I don't know, how best to interact with its specific systems. Speaking with that, or continuing with that, I guess, like, and maybe this is something that I only I really pay attention to if you guys don't remember a ton from the original, but the flow of combat in general feels pretty different. So, like, we've already kind of hit on that loop from the original of, like, stagger enemies, do a melee, knife them, whatever. And all of those things do exist, but I found it harder to do that, and not just because of the knife durability. So, like, in the original Resident Evil 4, staggers were 100% reliable. If you shot a running enemy in the knee, they would fall down. If you shot an enemy in the head, they would be meleeable. Whereas in the remake, they very much are not. Many instances of enemy charging me, and I would shoot them in a weak spot, expecting or hoping for a stagger, and they would not slow down at all, and then they would grab me, and I would be very sad.
Boy.
But where I'm going to with this is the combat is a lot faster and a lot more chaotic and more random. So, I mean, things like the staggers are random, and I think a lot of the enemies' behaviors are more varied and random like that as well. And I guess, like, how did you guys? I mean, this is admittedly kind of a big question, but just the combat flow in general, just, you know, moving around the arenas, juking and dodging enemies. And so opening it up past the knife now, just like switching between weapons, shooting weapons, throwing grenades, you know, whatever you had at your disposal. How did you find all the movement, you know, all of that stuff?
Yeah. It's so profoundly validating to hear you say that. Like, you like you have no idea how good it feels to hear you say that. Because
I'm glad to help you out here, Will.
Yeah, because I have been saying ever since Resident Evil 6 that something changed about the way that enemies react to bullets in Capcom's Resident Evil games. Like, I feel like it runs through 6, and then, of course, I even felt like it ran through the remake of 2 and 3. And then, of course, here again with 4. I don't feel like the enemies react well to bullets. And it's one of these things that I pay a really crazy amount of attention to. I even noticed it in Dead Space 3 that actually enemies don't respond to bullets the same way they do in 1 and 2. But there's something about that sort of reliability, or like knowing that you can stagger someone or having them react in a certain way, that makes the game feel so much better. But, you know, and of course, this is something that I noticed about 4, but I never hear anybody else mention this. Like, I really, and maybe I don't read enough game reviews, but I never hear anybody mention the fact that bullets don't affect enemies the way that they used to in a lot of these over-the-shoulder third-person horror games, survival horror, survival action, action horror, whatever your chosen nomenclature is. I spent basically a tremendous amount of time using the rifle in this game. So, you know, I think I had the semi-automatic rifle. I put some sort of crazy scope on it, and then I used it as much as humanly possible. You know, every time I would see a guy wandering, I would sort of take a pot shot at him, you know, get a headshot or whatever. And then last resort, you know, would be when guys would just come out of everywhere at me, or maybe I'd find myself in a bad situation. Those always felt bad to me. And I would end up just trying to get some headshots with my pistol and then do some kicks after it, or just like blast my shotgun everywhere. I ended up having that striker shotgun at the end, which has that big old circular mag. And so I was just blasting that around at the end. But yeah, I don't feel like it ever felt super great to me, the combat. But at the same time, I feel like it feels the same as the RE2 make and the RE3 make. You know, it's still kind of a little bit, like you said, unpredictable, and maybe it'll stagger them, maybe it won't. Um, there were certain sections that I feel like were that much rougher for me, like the protecting pieces where I felt like were really rough. Those encounters, there's a lot of encounters that I guess I wanted to kind of talk about and everything, but a lot of the protection time where you're protecting Ashley, they love to like separate you from her and then make you shoot guys that you don't have physical access to. And for some reason, I guess to me, it became even more obvious then that bullets don't affect enemies quite the same way, because you have a guy walking towards her and you're like wanting to stagger him and you're like, ugh, ugh, and he's not staggering. I remember having to shoot enemies through a grate. I remember one time she was up on the elevated platform and I was trying to keep enemies from getting to her, and it always felt, I don't know that I lost either of those encounters, but they definitely didn't feel, they felt messy, maybe to the end of this game, even playing the whole thing, I don't know that I felt super proficient by the end. It was still I still felt like I was a sloppy boy, just trying to somehow make my way through this whole thing. And I guess that makes it feel desperate in a way. But I do think I like the idea of feeling like I'm gaining a degree of mastery over things. And maybe this is more of an indictment on me as a player, that I didn't kind of gain the proficiency that I hoped I would. But anyway, that's sort of some thoughts on the general gameplay for me, which was rifle as much as possible, stay as far away from everything as possible. Then when I'm close to everything, do shots, and if I see someone is staggered for a roundhouse kick, run up and roundhouse kick them, or just pull out the shotgun and bubble blast as much as I can. But that was kind of how it felt.
Yeah, no, and I agree with a lot of that. And one of the things that made the original Resident Evil 4 so much fun to me, and I would say one of the biggest parts of its appeal and why it's one of my favorites, is that a lot of the combat mechanics were very reliable and predictable, and I felt like that allowed the player to do a lot of crowd control and a lot of like managing the situation, especially like could really see this playing Mercenaries in the original, where it was like, okay, you're like on a time limit and you're really trying to maximize score, and it's like, okay, I can really manage these crowds and crowd them in certain areas and like just really abuse the staggers and all of that stuff. And yeah, like everything you were saying about the remake, Will, I would agree with it. Like it took it took me longer than it should have to adjust my play, because I was trying to play it like the original a lot, but because things are like the staggers are inconsistent, and there's even other things of like you mentioned the striker in Resident Evil 4, the shotgun actually like pierces enemies. So if you need to like knock down a whole group, the striker will do that. Whereas in the remake, it only like hits the front layer. So you actually have a lot less crowd control options. And also the aiming is less precise in the remake. So you get like that little crosshair thing that like expands or shrinks based on how much you're moving. Whereas in the original, it was a red dot sight for every weapon. So it was 100% accurate for every weapon.
I do remember like shooting those, if you had to shoot one of those medallions from a long way away, you would have to stand there with your pistol for like 10 seconds before your reticle would like close in. And you're kind of like, all right, buddy, steady it up. Steady it up, Leon.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think what they're going for, and you kind of alluded to this, is I think they are going for more of like a scrappy survivalist kind of feel. Whereas like Resident Evil 4, like the original, like when I think back on that game, like I think of it as just such a precise game. Like it is a game where like if you have good movement, good placement, good aiming, like all that stuff, you can very with high precision just like do whatever you want to do, and some of these changes, like the inconsistent staggers in Resident Evil 4, make that just kind of impossible. So it's a much more scrappy game, and eventually by the end of the game, I adjusted, and for me, it became a much more mobile game of like just constantly, constantly on the move, which is especially contrasted with the original, because the original you couldn't move and shoot at the same time. But even in the remake, like I was mostly like, once I adjusted my play, like in the back half of the game, I was mostly running and like running around in circles around enemies, like literally just holding the run button, not shooting, and then, you know, taking a couple seconds to get a couple shots in and then booking it again. So I was just like constantly on the move, constantly picking stuff up, throwing whatever I had at the enemies. So it was a very different experience once I kind of got in that flow. How about you, Nate? Was there anything kind of broadly that stuck out about kind of the combat flow?
Yeah, just kind of going off of what you guys have been talking about, and I think I agree with a lot of what you've said. I think it's tricky because I do think the original game was more precise and had that sort of, I don't know, it had that setup where once you learned the game systems and you kind of learned the animations and how the movement worked, it was like you could just go into like that flow state where you're Neo and you see the Matrix, and like you're not fighting a horde of zombies, you're just like executing a set of commands that you know is gonna work, right?
Yeah,
a totally
that's
different
a good way
feel.
to put it. That's a good way to put it, because like when I go back and play the original Resident Evil 4 now, like I do feel like a puppet master of sorts. It's just like, all right, I know how to pull all these levers in my favor, and I'm gonna dance around these ganados and just have my way with them.
Yeah, it's like you said, like a dance. Like you have a scripted set of moves that you know is the optimal thing for this situation, and like that feels good. And I won't deny that. Like there's something about that flow in that game that feels really good and is cool. Not a lot of games do that specific thing. However, at the same time, I played the remake in a very scrappy, like, I don't really care about optimizing. I'm just gonna go roll with it, like throw whatever I have in the moment, run around, like I have no idea what I'm doing, and I had a good time with it. Like it was fine. I think if this was a game I was gonna play again, then I probably would notice or care more about what you guys are talking about. I would want to feel that level of mastery, and that might get frustrating.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I know a lot of that feeling for me is like I have played the original so much,
Right.
And I could certainly see people. I'm sorry.
No, sorry, I was going to move on. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I could certainly see, and even with that, like I could see people enjoying the remake style more.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think they're two different styles.
Yeah,
And like you said earlier, I think they had a different goal with this game. They did not intend to replicate that style of combat encounter that the original had for people like us that played it a lot and sort of figured out those patterns. And I think they had a different goal, like you said, for this game. And I think judging it by that goal, I feel like it's pretty solid. Like I don't have any real complaints about this game as a high-paced, high-tension, scrappy action game where it always feels like the walls are closing in on you and you're just like trying to keep your head above water and use whatever tools you have in the moment. Like that worked for me in this game.
Mm-hmm.
The two parts I will say that you guys mentioned that did sometimes annoy me, the lack of precision, were when Will, you were talking about like long range fighting against enemies that were trying to get Ashley, and you couldn't stagger them. I had that same frustration, and those were really annoying. And then like the having to wait, the length of time you have to wait to get the reticle precise felt too long, like for the distances that you're sometimes fighting at. Which often meant that I was impatient and would just like run in their face and pull out the pistol and just start dumping rounds into their head from 6 inches away.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. The thing I struggle with, which is going to be a consistent theme, is having played the original so much, is when I get frustrated by something, is it because I'm just such a fan of the original that I want it to be like that, or is it an actual frustration in the game? And I think there's a little of both, for sure. I also
I think that's fair. I don't think it's like unreasonable as a big fan of a specific style of gameplay from the original that other games have not done, to have a remake not have that same feeling. I think that's like a reasonable thing to be disappointed in.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing to think about with it is that, if we're trying to create this sort of scrappy feel, if we're trying to make a game that's sort of scarier or something, and this has always been, I've always been a bit more of a Dead Space guy, than a Resident Evil 4 guy. I think once Dead Space came out, I was like, well, why would anybody play Resident Evil 4 again? You got Dead Space now, but I think that like it had precision, and the enemies reacted in a way that was expected, yet the game was still very scary, and so I guess to me it's like, are these two things, do you have to create horror through chaos and unreliable shots, or unpredictable combat, or can you still have something that is scary and menacing and scrappy while maintaining a level of precision and predictability to your combat? I guess that's a question, but I don't know if I'm asking it to you guys or not. But I think it's, when it comes to your argument, where you're talking, Flex, about like, well, do I not like the game, or do I miss this? I don't know. I guess I'm thinking, if the first one wasn't scary enough because it was, because the combat was so predictable, and you can become such a machine, and then to create the scary, scrappy feeling, they had to reduce some of the precision. Anyway, I'll stop talking, but I think it's interesting to think about.
I get your point, and I think it's valid, and I'm not sure exactly where I come down on it, because I think, maybe it depends on what you mean by scary. Sometimes, like Dead Space has a certain atmosphere and style to it that is much scarier than any Resident Evil game to me. It has nothing to do with gameplay. But I also do think that Dead Space legitimately is also a more intense experience mechanically than Resident Evil 4 original is as well. But I don't know that I can quite quantify that off the top of my head right now.
To me, the most difficult place for me in the whole game, and this kind of speaks to some of this sort of crowd control elements that Flex is talking about, was defending the house. That I died more defending the house with what's his name, Luis, than I did in any other part of the game, I think
that was the same for me. I think I had the most game overs in that section of anywhere else in the game.
And
good margin.
And I got pretty frustrated. I actually had to like come back with a fresh set of eyes the next day, because I was like, kept getting wrecked trying to kick these ladders down and board up the windows and all that stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, and that's the kind of intensity that I think the game is going for. Is like, you're trying to work out, like, how do I deal with all these different entry points where enemies are coming into, and like, what's the most efficient way to like move between this area and keep enemies at bay and keep them in an area where I can like throw a well-timed grenade to take a bunch out, but it's like the game is constantly trying to push you to lose control at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's one encounter that is maybe a little poorly tuned because it's so easy to lose control of, and it's still early on enough in the game that like it's a real hurdle, or at least it was for me, and sounds like you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a tough sequence for me as well. I don't know if it was the one I died on the most, but it's in the running for sure. And I think one of the things that for me, like with this game, that makes it feel, because like you mentioned the Resident Evil 2 remake earlier, Will, and I don't know behind the scenes how this, I have no insight knowledge into Capcom's development of these games, but it feels like to me that they did use a lot of this like similar like kind of foundation from the Resident Evil 2 remake in Resident Evil 4 remake, with like the way the aiming reticle works and inconsistent staggers and like all of that kind of stuff. And I really like the Resident Evil 2 remake, and I think it's tricky here because, like, to compare those a little bit, the Resident Evil 2 remake, you typically don't fight more than a couple zombies at a time at most, and those zombies also move very slowly. And I think in the Resident Evil 4 remake, it gets tricky when you have like potentially dozens of enemies and they move a lot faster. And I think that makes it like that really does ratchet up the chaos. So it's like it's kind of a mix of different things. It's yes, the staggers and aiming and all of that isn't as precise as Resident Evil 4, but also compared to Resident Evil 2, which also has that imprecision, you're also fighting enemies on a level more comparable to the original Resident Evil 4. So it's kind of like it's mixing and matching these different elements in a way that I'm not sure, because like I feel like the original Resident Evil 4, it was, some people liked it, some people didn't, as more of an action game, but it did throw more enemies at you. They were faster, but you had more tools to deal with them. Resident Evil 2 is more of that slower pace survival horror thing. And I feel like Resident Evil 4 kind of mixes and matches those in a way that I'm not quite sure is the ideal mix for me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think you see it a lot in that house sequence. Is like you're in this really small enclosed space, and you get all these, like the Ganados just flooding in there like so fast, and you're dealing with imprecise tools to try and manage them.
Yeah, you're like, I shot you in the head. Oh, you don't care? Okay. Like just saying that to myself while I'm fighting.
I think that's why, like, and if I might be getting off topic here, but I feel like by the end of the, like, okay, when I think about original Resident Evil, I think about, like, what you were talking about, the most optimal ways to play a combat encounter was, like, well-placed shots to take advantage of...
the original Resident Evil 4?
Yes, the original Resident Evil 4, sorry.
That's okay.
Well-placed shots to stagger enemies and then take advantage of those moments. Mm-hmm. Usually by, like, doing a kick move that would give you like invincibility frames and then like send them flying through a group of enemies and stagger them.
I mean, Resident Evil 4 was the original Doom remake. You know what I mean? Yeah. You shot them, then you closed the distance, I
mean, yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Push forward combat, right? That's this game?
Yeah. And so by the end of the remake of Resident Evil 4, I was doing a lot less of worrying about precision shots and more of like, I'm going to corral these enemies into a group together and then use one of the like, high-powered shotgun blast or a grenade or a explosive bolt from my crossbow to just like kill a bunch of enemies at once. And so it's just like a different style of play emerged, I think, which is that's why I said like I feel like it's tricky. I think it's just like different, but I 100% get like anybody looking for the same style of play that the original game had, not finding it here, feeling disappointed in that.
Yeah, and like I go back and forth on like how much I should I should weigh that, because I do think Resident Evil, like the remake, does deserve to be judged like on its own merits and not just compared to Resident Evil 4. As much as I love the original Resident Evil 4, I think even with that, there are some frustrations. Even though by the end of the game, that combat flow you were just describing, Nate, I also got to that point where, yeah, I was just constantly running around. If it was like a single enemy, I would take some pot shots with my pistol, not really caring about headshots or where I hit it, because that's less important here. Though there are some really nerdy technical details I could get into about that, which I will not. The way they've changed damage and criticals is different in a way in this time around. But and then once you find the opportune situation where a bunch of enemies are grouped up, then you can switch to a bigger thing to deal more area damage. And
I do think that they give you more tools to do those, like to incentivize you to do more of those like bigger area bursts of damage. Like with the crafting system, I think you're allowed more like wiggle room on that stuff, because you can make grenades and you can make explosive bolts. Whereas I feel like in the original, and you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this, I feel like those like area of effect explosives were powerful but pretty limited.
Yeah, so I both agree and disagree with that.
Okay.
So I think you get more like being able to craft ammo as you want, and being able to craft grenades and explosive bolts, I think does give you a little bit more flexibility, and you can often craft something when you need it. I think there's one big change that actually gives you less options, and that's what I mentioned about the shotgun earlier, is that in the original Resident Evil 4, a single shotgun blast could knock down a whole glob of enemies single-handedly, whereas now it only knocks down the front row. And on top of that, unless you're using the striker, they've also narrowed the blast radius for all the other shotguns. So if you're using like the riot gun or the starting shotgun, not only is it not piercing, but it's also got a very narrow spread. So the shotgun.
I definitely remember feeling like the starting and riot, or not, the riot gun shotgun were like not very useful, other than like getting up in the belly of something with a lot of health and just dumping in it.
Yeah, and this is probably a good time to switch to weapons, because I think there's a whole lot to talk through there as well. One last comment I'll make before we leave all the movement stuff is, we mentioned, as someone was talking, I remember this interaction, but we've mentioned the loop multiple times of like shooting someone in a weak spot, running up, doing a melee, and then knifing them from the original Resident Evil 4. And I tried that so many times in the remake, and it so often does not work, because like in addition to the inconsistency of the staggers, your movement speed from still to running is a lot slower in the remake, and that's despite the enemies being as fast as they are. But what I found is that if I like shot an enemy in the head or the knee or whatever, something that might stagger them, if I didn't immediately start running towards them, because my start still to run speed is so like that ramp up so much slower, I have to start running immediately if I want to have a chance at doing a melee, like a roundhouse kick or a suplex or whatever. But if I have to start running immediately, that means I don't have time to wait to see if it actually staggered them or not. So it's like you kind of have to play this weird guessing game prediction that in my opinion, fundamentally just does not work. And I feel like the way they've changed the inconsistency makes the whole melee system feel very risky and just not really even worth trying all that often, honestly. So I think I was thinking of that as one last point to make, is like that's something that, irregardless of like nostalgia and like wanting it to be like the original, I feel like kind of doesn't work with just the way those various things intertwine.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I don't know that I have a strong opinion on it. I feel like I tried the same thing, and I feel it probably worked sometimes and sometimes didn't.
Yeah,
And would just be like one of those things where I have to figure out what to do next if it doesn't work.
yeah, it was definitely my experience. Sometimes it'd work and sometimes it wouldn't, and that makes it unreliable, as we've said. But yeah, I do think this would be a good. We already kind of started talking about the shotgun. I do think this would be a good way to transition to weapons. And to clarify the point I was starting to make is I think one option they have taken away is I think the shotguns are just way worse in the remake. So while I agree, so when I said I both agree and disagree, I do think those other things have become more flexible, like grenades and explosive bolts. But I think the shotgun has become less effective. So I think that's one big reduction in your options, if that makes sense.
My favorite use of the shotgun, to be honest, was the dudes who walked at you with like wooden shields. Like that was my main shotgun use. Actually, I was like, "Oh!" And here he comes. He's like hiding behind his little shield, and you just blow it apart. And then you're like, "All right, now I can deal with you the same way I dealt with the rest of these jabronis." But yeah, that was a key shotgun use. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did you guys like the weapons? What were your go-to guns? Like, I don't know. Just kind of how did you feel about the weapon selection overall?
You gonna start, Nate?
Sure. I definitely started the game using mostly pistol because that's what I feel like is the thing in these games is you use the basic accurate pistol as long as you can. And I think the pistols are okay. I did you'll have to tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. Halfway through the game, I was using the starting pistol, which I had upgraded, and I was like, I'm gonna wait until I get the last pistol before I get any other pistols and upgrade them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like halfway through the game, I was like, wait, am I remembering this right? I think maybe the Red 9 is the good pistol from the original, which may or may not translate to the remake. I have no idea. But I had that moment of like something long dormant in my brain was like, no, the Red 9. Use the Red 9. So I don't know if that was accurate or not.
So did you use Red 9 then?
And I was just like, no, I'm already committed to this plan of just sticking with the starting pistol until I get like the end game pistol.
So when you say end game pistol, do you remember which one it was that you used? Because there's there are 5 total pistols, and the last 2 you kind of get around the same time.
I want to say it was the Blacktail.
Okay, that's what I would assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also the Matilda that you can get from the Spinel shop, and that opens up about the same time as the Blacktail does from the actual merchant shop.
Yeah. So yeah, I used the starting pistol and then skipped every other pistol and waited for the Blacktail, and then upgraded that. Upgraded the knife a lot as quickly as I could. Basically skipped some machine guns. Didn't use them. I used shotguns. I didn't use a ton of rifle, although I had one equipped most of the game and would like pull it out at the start of an encounter, but didn't really use it outside of that. And started off the game not using the bolt thrower, but ended up like mid-game switching to using it a lot and really liked that.
Yeah. So what shotgun was the one you ended up sticking with? Do you remember?
So by the end of the game, it was the striker.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I just did the normal progression of whatever the starting shotgun is to the riot gun to the striker.
And do you remember what rifle? You said you didn't use a lot of rifle, but do you remember which one you used when you used it? It's okay if you don't remember.
I don't remember specifically.
So the 3 rifles, there's the initial bolt action rifle, the first rifle you get. Then there's the Stingray, which is the semi-auto. And then there's a new gun, which wasn't even in the original, which is like an actual assault rifle, which is just like pure rapid fire.
Yeah, I didn't use that. I used the Stingray.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the bolt gun is one of the more interesting additions to the game, and at first I wasn't sure what to make of it, but like you, I ended up using it a lot by the end of the game. Like I thought the explosive bolts were really powerful, and even the regular bolts, I ended up upgrading the bolt thrower a lot. So even the regular bolts dealt okay damage, like still not as good as the other guns, but for being reusable ammo, like the bolts you could pick back up, like they were pretty decent. So I would often use them when I was just facing like one or two or maybe even just three regular enemies. Like when it was like a manageable number of enemies. I was like, oh, I'm not going to use bullets on them. I'm going to use these bolts.
Mm-hmm. I'm just gonna say it and put it out here because I feel like it needs to be said that the addition of stealth kills and the bolt thrower crossbow style weapon basically make this version of Resident Evil 4 like the Evil Within, and I think that's why I like it more than you.
You know, that's totally fair. I'm sure someone out there is doing a full just knife plus bolt thrower run where you never actually fire loud bullets, just like a full stealth run of this game. It's probably doable. I don't know. I guess the broad question here is like, did you find the guns as a whole like fun to use? Do you feel like you had like different guns for different roles, and do you like the selection on offer? And I don't know, like.
I did. I definitely felt like the set of guns I kind of went with and upgraded felt good, and I liked the upgrade paths and everything. The one criticism I guess I would offer is like I often felt like I needed to make big decisions about what guns to invest in or to buy even without knowing anything about how it would feel to use, and like just had to kind of like, I don't know, I'm just gonna flip a coin and pick something.
Yeah. So one change, which I like that they made in the remake compared to the original, is the sellback price on the guns in the remake is you get 95% of the money you spent, and that includes upgrades. So like if you just went ham upgrading the starter pistol and then decided later you wanted to switch to the blacktail you said you ended up using, you could sell back that starter pistol and you'd get 95% of the total cost you've spent, even through all the upgrades. So I feel like the remake made it a lot easier to like switch guns. Like there's a little bit of a penalty. You do lose 5% of that cost, but that's not that big in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and I did like that system and took advantage of that. To just leapfrog upgrades up the chain basically, which is good. As more of the question was always like, do I buy this new gun in the shop or not? And like spend all the money I've accumulated for the past chapter and a half to try out this submachine gun that I don't know if I'll actually use.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I wanted the weapons to be like a thing we talked about is the original Resident Evil 4 is, I'm sure it's not the first game that did this, but it's one of the first games I remember of having like a robust gun upgrade system and like the guns being just fun to use. So that is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about them. And of course the remake has that as well. What about you, Will? What were your favorite guns? What were your go-tos? How did you like the arsenal as a whole? All that good stuff.
Well, I used the Red 9 a tremendous amount. That kind of was my pistol that I just used until the end of everything. I got the striker, used it in, whenever I got crowded by clowns or I needed to break a shield. I busted out the striker and just kind of blasted around kind of haphazardly. I think I kept that first rifle kind of until the end of the game. Nice. I don't know if like it didn't seem like the power, like I didn't want to shoot any faster. And so I guess in my mind, I was like, well, why would I get a different one? And it also seemed that everything I was shooting, it kind of did the same amount to. So like I would shoot them in the head and it would either kill them or they'd grow an extra centipede face, And so it was so I was like, well, I don't really need a more damaging one because, I mean, it's not going to like blow off their head and the centipede face,
Mhm.
So I just kept that first one.
Yeah. Well, the first one, so interestingly, the first rifle is the highest damage rifle. That's
Yeah.
how that's the benefit it has for having such slow fire speed. So the trade-off on the rifles is really damage versus rate of fire.
Yeah, because I mean, I was using it from so far away. Like I'd walk into some area and then like squint my eyes and see if I could see enemies. Like, because sometimes before you walk in the arena, you'll just see some of them just wandering around, and you can go ahead and knock a bunch of them out with the rifle. Sometimes you'll shoot one of them and then they'll get all their attention will get on you. But sometimes you can take out like 3 or 4 of them with nobody even noticing. And then I started with that broken butterfly thing and then upgraded to the Killer 7 in the Magnums. Like I already said, I didn't do anything with the knives. I started trying to use that little, what is that little bolt thrower thing? And I think I did use the mine a couple of times, the mines with it, but I was trying to shoot the bolts regularly and I could never get a sense of what it was doing. Like I would try and shoot a guy and it was like the bolt would move slower than physically possible or something like that and then stick in the wall behind them and I was like, what is happening? And so I think I started using it, that I found some mines and used those mines, and then when the mines ran out, I think I just sold the bolt thrower back. Like, forget this thing. I don't know what's happening here, but clearly Nate used it to good effect. So, I'm sure it's capable, but yeah. So that was kind of where I was at with it.
Yeah, it is a little. I did find it harder to aim. Like the bolts did move a little slower, and I didn't try shooting stuff at long range with the bolt thrower. I kind of had to find like a good medium range to make use of it.
Maybe that was the problem, but I was just across a room. I mean, I definitely wasn't right behind them or anything, but yeah, I shot it and I was like, that felt weird. But overall, I mean, I guess I felt like I had a good pile of stuff. I usually had a flash grenade when I needed one, which was good because, oh my God, I'm not going to get ahead of myself with the enemies, but dude in the red robe like made you like use those freaking flash grenades.
Yes, yes, you did.
But yeah, I thought the arsenal was fine. My favorite part of the arsenal was the helicopter guy that follows you around in the later chapter. I mean, he was Mike. A good part of the arsenal. Yeah, Mike in the helicopter.
Your good friend Mike.
Yeah, I was into that part of the arsenal. He was the man. But anyway, yeah, pretty good. What would you call it? Arsenal,
Yeah.
And then it's like I had a charm. I'm just going to mention this. This doesn't even go here, but I had this dumb charm that like made the fish, the black bass, whatever, like heal me like 100% more. And so, for some reason in the game, you just find these things in the weirdest places. You like open up a cabinet and there's like a black bass in there, and I was like, "Holla!" So, like gonna save you for a tough situation. So I'd get surrounded and start chowing on my fish. You know what I mean? Anyway,
yeah, those fish are handy.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
No, you're good. Yeah, no, I was pretty similar with you guys on the weapons. You are correct, Nate, that in the original, the Red 9 is definitely the best pistol. Yeah. And I think one thing they've done well in the remake is, especially with the handguns, maybe a little less so with the others, but they've done a good job in the remake of there are 5 handguns in the remake, and I think all of them have potential. Like, I think all of them have valid uses, and they've done a better job at like differentiating them and giving them different properties. So like the starting pistol and the Punisher, the only 2 that can get the red dot sight, and there's argument to be made that like not having that cursor that shrinks in and being 100% accurate is valuable, even if they don't deal as much damage as the Red 9, which is still the highest damage pistol, but it's also not as accurate. So you get trade-offs like that, whereas like the Black Tail's a little kind of in between those two, and then the Punisher also penetrates enemies, so that has value. So I think they've done an interesting job at doing trade-offs, because I still use the Red 9 because I also have that is also my habit for Resident Evil 4, but I don't know that I can confidently say it's the best pistol anymore. So they've done a better job at like differentiating those. I do get frustrated that my biggest disappointment with the weapons in this game is I just don't think the shotguns are very good. I think the shotguns have just gotten, I don't know, their use case, because the original Resident Evil 4 had like very defined roles for the different weapon categories. So like pistol was, handling just a couple enemies, shotgun was your crowd control, and rifle was your high damage or range. Rifle was like what you used to knock down elite enemies or something. But I feel like the shotgun just doesn't have a good role anymore. It's like, what is it good for that the other guns can't do? But I think we'll mostly move on from the weapons. And I guess enemies and or encounters is what we can talk at next. We've kind of touched a little bit on both, but I mean, this is really, I guess, just opening the floor in general to memorable enemies or encounters or anything you want to shout out in that area. The summoner enemy that's already been mentioned, the red robe guy, that's a new enemy in the remake, and the first encounter where like that enemy is introduced was also one of the encounters I had to try many times. And I played this game. That's exactly what he sounds like. And I played this, I don't know what difficulty you guys played on. I played one notch above normal. I forget what it's called. And yeah, that first encounter was pretty rough. The flash grenades still is useful. Flash grenades were very powerful in the original. They're still very powerful here. As you mentioned, they're very good for those enemies. Mm-hmm. And from then on out, once I learned what that enemy was about, like every time I saw one of those guys, it was like, all right, honing in on that summoner and where he needs to go immediately.
Yeah, and there were some encounters where he would like change location a couple times. You'd like shoot him in the face, and then he's like, "Oh no!" and then he'd like run over to the other side and be like, "Oh, blah." I was like, "Come on, man, stay here and get your whooping."
Yeah, those are the encounters where I usually pulled out my Magnum. I'd get up to that guy, and it was time to use those precious Magnum bullets.
Right.
I was about to say those are when I pulled out the rifle and just dumped all my rifle ammo from wherever I could see them.
Yeah. I'd say the things that are the most memorable to me. One is the Krauser fight. I thought was cool, especially the first part where you're kind of sneaking around trying not to hit his trip mines, and he'll sneak out there and start like popping you from behind a wall or something like that. I thought that encounter was pretty cool. I don't know. It was like you were, I don't know. It reminded me kind of like Apocalypse Now or something like that. I don't know. He's like some sort of demented major, that you have to like, go through the jungle to find or something like that. In this case, it was sort of like, I don't know, desert ruins or something like that. I like that encounter.
I like that fight, that whole sequence, because it didn't feel like I'm going to put you in an arena with a guy with a lot of health. It felt like a whole area was designed around this encounter, and it felt cool to like be going through this thing. And it was like when the game was reaching like ridiculous action levels, like just like so much going on, and you're just like running through these like ruined structures. This guy just keeps like dropping in on you, and you fight him for a second, and then he jumps out of a window cackling, and then you keep moving, and that keeps happening. Like I thought it was a cool sequence.
He's like, yeah. I thought you could do better, rookie, or whatever he would call you or something.
Yeah, I like that sequence as well. And in the original Resident Evil 4, the Krauser fight's probably actually one of my least favorite sequences, but I think they did a better job here. I also think they did a better job just with Krauser's character in general. Like I think they fleshed him out a little more and like kind of at least alluded to the like his past and relationship with Leon more. And then yeah, he's like using all those traps like military style. I mean, the whole third act on the island is the most actiony part of the game. It was in the original as well, and he's like the major boss of the island. So like, yeah, to your point, it was had a little bit of a like unique flavor to it, and like the whole arena was built around him specifically.
Yeah. That was a cool moment. Also, I just think this is funny, so I'm going to mention it. There's this part where I can't remember the names of the enemies, but the big regenerating blob guys that you have to use the thermal scope to shoot their little special bits.
Oh, you mean the regenerators?
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Those, yeah.
That's their official name.
Yeah, so those I thought those fights were kind of wild. And one thing that was so funny is when I first started fighting them, you know, I had a decent amount of rifle ammo, and that's kind of what I had to use because I had put that scope on it, that little thermal scope or whatever. And I didn't realize that you could look through the thermal scope and see that one of them had actually which one had the wrench that you needed to progress. Yep. And so I was like killing, like I had to kill like 4 of them. I think I killed like all of them because the last one I scanned, I saw the wrench and I was like, oh my God. It like used all of my ammo fighting these losers, you know. But I did
notice you could see the wrench, but I still fought the others because they drop like treasures and stuff that you could sell for money. So I still think it was worth killing all of them.
Yeah, it was all right, but I just thought it was so funny that was the last one that I scanned, was the one that already had the wrench and it was just sitting in his body, and I was like, ugh.
Yeah, as far as I know, you don't have to fight all of them. I just quick comment on the regenerators is like from the jump from the original to the remake. I think some enemies are harder, some are easier between the games. The regenerators, in my opinion, are by far the enemies that got the biggest difficulty bump. Like they are so much harder in the remake, so much more intense. They move faster. They take more shots. They have more blobs in them. I think they actually regenerate faster. I didn't do like a direct comparison, but like and I think they also put them in tougher rooms. So like there's one particular room. I don't know how to describe this, but like there's like a bunch of those like body bags or meat bags.
Oh yeah, and they're all full of regenerators.
Yeah, and you have to like loop around and like hit a button, and then you have a time limit to run from the button to a door to get out. And
oh man, yeah, I didn't fight any regenerators in that room.
Yeah, because there's basically not enough room to get like a long stretch to like look down the scope of your rifle as they're coming at you. So like I think the environments they put the regenerators in also makes them harder in this game.
Yeah, one of them slides out of a vent like and just plops down right in front of you, and that's like the way you have to go one time. And I'm like, you.
Yeah, that was one of those areas of the game where I figured out like a specific like number like of a way to do something and just kept doing that. Like I figured out the blacktail that I had at that moment exactly how many shots it took to blow off a regenerator's legs. You know, it just like, oh, there's one. Pop, 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 pop. Okay, keep running.
Yeah. Yeah, my go-to was the striker to take out their legs. Just aim that down. But also they moved faster on the ground than walking. Like I noticed this too. I would like knock them down to try and get away from them, but like I don't know, they might be faster when they're slithering than when they're on 2 feet.
Yeah.
Like there would be like a couple seconds when you first knock them down when they like wouldn't recover yet. So like you could use that to get away. But like once they actually started moving again on the ground, like I don't know if that was actually better.
Yeah. I remember another part that I wanted to kind of think about was there are these turrets that like have out these little red nets, I guess, these little red scanning things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I tried on 2 different occasions to like disable one, get the enemies, run backwards and try to re-enable it. And it never it never worked. Like the enemies would never follow me into the grid. And I was so frustrated about that. But those little areas where you're like going through the little buildings and having to like weave through those like sentry gun fields, I thought was an interesting encounter. Um, when you talk about enemies that always got you, the beast head guy that has like the nail gun or whatever,
Yeah.
like he wrecked me every time he came out. I underestimated him. I'm like, oh, this guy, and he would like, wind up his little nail gun, and then like once it got started, it could just chew you to pieces. And so I think I died to him once every time because you see him and you're like, because there's the one beast-headed guy with the hammer, and he's a threat, but he's not a bad guy. He's not bad. And then I think there's one with a chainsaw, and I didn't even think he was that bad. But then the one would pop out with a nail gun, and I'm like, oh, it's just another beast-head guy. And then he would saw me in half with his nails. That was a wild. I don't know if anyone has anything to add on those 2 particular ones, or if anyone had trouble with those, or thought those situations were particularly interesting.
Yeah, no, those guys could definitely be tough. I do think most of the other elite enemies were not kind of along the lines of what you were saying, like the hammer one or the some of the other ones. Like I feel like a lot of them weren't, or the chainsaw one. I feel like a lot of them weren't actually that threatening.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to shout out in terms of this was for some reason I remember the clock tower when you're climbing it, those spiky balls coming down. It was the game usually doesn't let you feel like a badass, but at least it felt that way to me a lot of times. But when I got up to the top where the lever was, and then I started walking down, and then the enemies came out, I was like, have I got something for you? And I was so pleased that they let it work, that you could walk back up, pull the lever, and then drop the spiky ball on those enemies.
Yes.
Because especially earlier when it wouldn't let me run the enemies into the field for the sentry gun, I was like, you're going to let me do something fun, game. And it did. And I was pleased. So those are some of my favorite moments, I guess, or like encounters, I would say.
Yeah. No more giant Salazar statue chase sequence though in the clock tower.
Nah.
I don't know if you guys remember that from the original.
I think I vaguely remember it, but yeah, not the specifics.
It's one of the goofiest parts of that game.
Oh, that's saying something.
Yeah, it's not in the remake. What about you, Nate? Like standout enemies or encounters, or just anything you want to give a shout out to here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think a lot of the stuff on the island is like a cool way to change things up in the third act, and it's, if the game is going to keep going at that point, they kind of need to do that, which we talked about a lot of that stuff. I definitely like the castle environment. I think it's cool, and like, I don't know, that was probably the part where I was like diving with the game the most for some reason. I don't know if it's because of specific enemy compositions or specific encounters, but that's the part that stands out to me in my memory.
So yeah, I mean, it's probably worth talking about a little bit because I feel the same way. Both the original and the remake kind of have a 3-act structure. You're in the village first, and then the castle, and then the island. And the village is the most iconic. Like that's, I think, what a lot of people picture when they think about Resident Evil 4. And in the original game, the island felt like, okay, like this is getting both a little long and a little over the top. Like the island is just where it goes full action.
Yeah.
But I think in the remake, especially, And I don't know if this is just a combination of like where your guns are with your upgrades, or just the balance of like as the game starts out like more stealthy and creepy and just ramps towards action in the island, if maybe the castle is just like the sweet spot in the middle.
I think
But
so, yeah.
I definitely, for me at least, on the difficulty I played on, the village was the hardest section of the game by far. Like, once I got my guns upgraded and collected a little more ammo, like things got a lot more manageable, and the castle section was like felt like a sweet spot. It felt like, okay, like I'm getting into a flow. Like I think the enemies encounters are still fun before it gets to like kind of the over the topness of the island. So yeah, I don't know that I like can quite fully describe it, but I do think I had the most fun in this game in the castle section.
Yeah. Some parts we haven't talked about, I guess, that are in the castle section that I remember being kind of hurdles or sore points for me, I guess, were the hedge maze.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why. Every time I felt like I backtracked through that hedge maze like 6 times for some reason, and I don't feel like I needed to, but I did. And every time I
Same.
walked through that hedge maze, there was another dog for some reason. I was like, I don't want to deal with you. Go
There was
away.
a dog spawner. There had to be a dog spawner somewhere in that hedge maze.
Yeah, I don't know. There could be a way that they keep spawning stuff. I felt
don't
like
know.
it spawned dogs until you cleared the whole area, because I definitely, like, for some side missions, I would end up going back through the maze later in the game and there weren't any enemies. But I definitely remember backtracking before I like completed everything and felt like, why are there more dogs here now? So like,
Why is this dog here? Go away. And then the haven't talked about the sections where you play as Ashley, which I think are mostly in the castle or all in the castle.
I think they are, yeah. So yeah, that was one of the things I had written down. So
Yeah.
yeah, this is probably a good point to talk about those. How'd you find the Ashley sections?
I thought, they were okay. I think it was a fine idea. They're a little, I don't know. I guess they're a little mechanically simple. The point where, like, after a few minutes of being like, wow, this is terrifying, I don't want to do this, then realizing like, oh, actually, this is like basically nothing, and then just kind of having to go through the motions of like running around these dumb statues, freezing them with your lantern. Wasn't maybe the most enjoyable part of the game for me.
Yeah, which the Ashley section in the original was also like one of the sections people didn't like. I didn't really care for it either. And I think they
Yeah.
tried to do more with this one, and it is more involved than it was in the original, and I think in a way better, but it's also way longer. So I'm also like, yeah, the moment to moment's better, but I would also rather it just be shorter.
Mm-hmm.
I liked, and this is probably somewhat on brand for me, but I liked being able to navigate those sections again with Leon. I think in some ways, for me at least, it highlighted how capable Leon was, and made you feel a little bit more like a badass after you navigated those sessions with Ashley and found that you couldn't do anything, like you couldn't deal with anything. And then I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go check out this area that like I didn't really want to go with Ashley, and I can go back down these stairs and see what's down there because she was over here getting impaled when she was doing it, and so that was an interesting little. I thought that was an interesting thing to go back through those zones again with your capable boy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's why I said I do think it's a good idea. I guess maybe it's just what we said. It was maybe too long that I got by the end of it. I was like, okay, I'm tired of doing this run around, but I don't mind the idea.
Yeah. Any other scenario shout outs, Nate?
That's sticking out to me right now.
While we're in the castle, I'll go ahead and mention the encounter that I'm pretty sure I died the most on, which was in the castle.
Okay.
It's the room with the double Garradors. It's got the two, so the Garradors are like the enemies with the big claws. They're blind. And there's one room in the castle that has two of them, and it's a fairly small room. And at least on the difficulty I played on, that encounter was brutal.
Yeah, I could see that.
They have a lot of health and they kill you very quickly. And I remember when I finally beat that encounter, it was a situation of like Leon's barely any health left. He's like holding his side, staggering through. I have no health items left on me. I'm basically have used all my ammo. I got like nothing left. It's just like, we did it, Leon. We did it.
Yeah.
Those are the ones with the Voldo claws, with the swipey claws that were just, I remember those guys.
One of them at a time was actually very easy, I thought, but it was only that room where there were two of them and little guys spawn. So like, regular enemies. So
I was about to say.
Yeah.
I had to break up my fish.
Yeah. So like the regular enemies, which infina spawned until you killed the Garradors, made it really hard to like be able to sneak up behind them or anything because you're constantly having to deal with them.
Yeah.
That encounter was also in the original and was also pretty hard in that game as well. So there are definitely a lot of encounters that have been preserved. Any other shout outs, Nate?
Yeah, I can't think of anything. I feel like I feel like the village section of the game is, like you said, it's iconic, and it kind of is a lot of what Resident Evil 4 is, but I don't know, for some reason I think that nothing in that section really stands out to me from playing this remake this year. I mean, kind of felt like I was going through the motions.
Yeah, I do think it's a good area, and I think my memory of my memory of the village and the remake specifically was a lot of like trying to shed my original Resident Evil 4 habits. So like it was a lot of coming to terms with the changes of the combat. Like a lot of that adjustment happened for me in the village. So when I think of the village, that's a lot of what I think of is like learning this game's particular language.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
The one thing in the village that I do want to call out is the chapter with the lake. They really expanded the lake area and kind of almost made it like a fairly open area where. So we haven't talked about, but maybe now's the time to talk about, like, you do get side quests from the merchant. You get requests from him and that you can complete for spinels. And that's how his like specialty shop you spend spinels on. And yeah, the lake area is one of the biggest areas in the game where it's like, okay, you can really spend a few hours here, like just doing optional side content and going back and forth across the lake in that little speedboat. Did you guys like that lake area, or I don't know? Did you? And also in general, did you guys do a lot of the side quest for the merchant, or did you play it more straight through?
Yeah, I did most of the side stuff. I don't know if I did like everything in the game, but I feel like I did most of the stuff that as it came up and tried to like find all the, I don't know, treasures and whatever, do all the little things that were hidden around the world. And I like that part of this game. Like, as much as I think, like this is an action game, it's about fighting zombies and managing your resources and all that stuff. Like, part of the core fun of this game to me is that just like constantly little moments of progression and like, oh, I'm checklisting and then I'm taking that back to the merchant and then I'm upgrading my guns and like that loop just feels good in this one.
Yeah. What about you, Will?
I like the you were asking about the boat section. I thought that was a pretty cool section. It's where you get that red 9.
Mm-hmm.
You know, yeah. In the terms of the side stuff, I don't know. I think I did a decent chunk of it. I never actually got enough spindles to get the thing that you need to get an exclusive weapon upgrade. Which I was kind of thinking like, man, that could have been cool, but I just never really got there. I think I got a little bit of shy because I went and fought this dog in the village at the very end of that, and that dog was the healthiest dog I think. Like I just used like all of my stuff, and then I was like, uh-oh, and I kept going, but I just felt like really I felt pretty vulnerable for like the next 30 minutes or so. And I was like, man, I don't know if I want to go do that. And then later on, they're like, there's a gigantic knight where Ashley was hanging out. Do you want to go deal with him?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think I'm going to let him do what he's doing, So I did some of it, but not all of it.
They had those side quests that were like, there's a strong version of this enemy wandering around, and it was always just like, have 10 times as much health as a normal one. Just go dump all your ammo into this guy and you can complete this side quest. I don't think I ever actually like died to any of those. It was just like, oh, here's a way to make you spend a bunch of resources.
Yeah, the one in the castle in the island, there was one of those super enemies in each area. But yeah, the dog in the village, and I do think this is probably a difficulty thing, because like I said, like the village area, I just struggled with ammo and stuff the whole time. So when I had to fight that dog, I think I just had like a handful of bolts, a couple resources to craft like one thing of ammo, and like 10 pistol bullets, I think is all I had. And I had to make very creative use of explosive bolts to beat that dog.
He was a healthy pooch.
He was very healthy.
I like when you finally got the key in that first area that opens those shrines. That felt really good to me because you bumble around and you see those shrines everywhere, those wooden ones, and then you finally get the key, and then it's like all these different places you can go and unlock and get like treasures and necklaces and funky beetles and stuff. So that was kind of neat.
Yeah, I do think all that stuff works in this game. I liked having the side quests as like additional objectives to do, and in each of the 3 zones, I do feel like you walk back and forth through areas enough that doing the side quest feels like not like a cumbersome thing, like it fits. And then yeah, you get those extra keys or whatever to unlock places you've seen before that you couldn't get, and I think that works in a way that's not frustrating. Like sometimes in games that can be frustrating, but I think the way you navigate these areas in this game in the remake is, I think it works. Like I did enjoy those systems quite a bit. So I'm kind of gonna just run down. Oh, I guess last quick thing. How did you, when you, Nate kind of talked about earlier about how you would just let enemies pick up Ashley, but generally speaking, the sections where Ashley was following you, like, Ashley is, I guess, kind of infamous in a way in the in the original Resident Evil of just screaming for help all the time. They made some changes to her, like there's not as many dumpsters you can tell her to hide in anymore. She also doesn't have her own health bar, which she did in the original. If she gets hit, she just gets knocked down, and you like do you just go up next to her and hit a prompt to pick her back up. I don't know. Maybe there's not really anything worth commenting on here, but is there anything that stood out about Ashley in this game to you all, or do you think it was mostly just kind of whatever?
I can't remember much about the original game. I remember, couldn't she hide in like dumpsters?
Yes, yeah.
I don't think that's a thing she could do in this one.
No.
There were like lockers that I guess you could put her in, but I don't remember dumpsters.
Yeah, there were a couple
which was a real loss. I'm kidding.
Yeah, there were a couple like kind of scripted points where you could put her in a locker, usually around boss fights, but yeah, there weren't dumpsters around in the same way there were in the original. I thought it was mostly okay. I thought she was harder to control because in the original you could tell her to stay put or follow. In the remake, it was follow at a distance or follow closely, which to me didn't really seem like much of a difference. So I felt like you had a little less control over her. But also, as Nate was pointing out earlier, she was never really that much danger anyway.
I mean, I was always just like accidentally clicking in the stick because I've got heavy hands, and that's just what happens to me when I'm playing anything. And so, like, she was constantly like, okay, I'll stay back. All right, here I come. Okay, I'll stay back. All right, just over and over and over. And I'm like, yeah, all right, well, yeah, it was a situation. Anyway,
Yeah,
but I think I lost one time because someone carried her once or twice when someone carried her out of her room. There was like there was one where it was like she's up these stairs and she's like holding a door open for you, and it's like as soon as you like open the door, like there's a little cut scene and all the enemies walk in, and it's like one of those scenes that Nate was talking about where they all just charge up the stairs at her, and so you have to come back out there just like guns blazing, because they also don't seem like they have all that far to take her that time or something like that, or I don't know, but yeah, there were some of those moments where they're like, "Come here, girl," and then it was over.
Yeah, most of the time I feel like she just wasn't really in any danger. It was like I would mostly just stick by her, and like she got grabbed, I would just stab whoever grabbed her. If she got knocked down, I would just pick her up, and then it was fine.
Yeah. Before we get to, we're going to try and wrap up in the next 10-ish minutes here. I'm just going to read through a couple notes I have written down that we hadn't gotten to. None of these necessarily have to be talking points unless anyone has anything to say on them. We haven't mentioned the shooting gallery mini game. That was expanded more here, but also and also I think was a lot harder in the remake.
Extremely difficult.
Yeah, I did complete all of them. I don't know that the rewards were as worth it because we've kind of alluded to the charms. And I don't know. I kind of have some issues with the charms because a lot of them are like extra chance to craft pistol bullets when you craft bullets, and it's like, well, I'm just gonna go switch on that charm when I'm about to craft bullets and then take it off again immediately. And like, I don't know. I think the whole charm system leads to a lot of fiddly behavior like that. It's kind of not satisfying. And also, they're completely random which ones you get. So there could be like maybe they're good ones that I just didn't see. I don't know. You mentioned one earlier, Nate, that I didn't even get. So it is completely random which ones you get. Whereas your reward for doing it in the original was a lot of money, which was very useful. There's a whole boss in the original, you guys might not remember it, but it was later in the game. The boss was called U3, but you like got pinned in this like floating maze that was like a bunch of cargo containers assembled in a maze, and like different parts of it kept dropping off, and you like kept getting in smaller area. It's probably the most noteworthy omission from the original that didn't make it into the remake. You look confused. I'll send you a video of it later.
I was trying to think, but I cannot remember that boss.
Yeah, if you go Google Resident Evil 4 U3, you'll probably find it. There's a couple like story changes. So like in the remake, Luis killed, or Krauser killed Luis instead of Sadler. So like there's a couple things like that changed. Some of the moments where Ada popped up as well. When you meet Krauser is also later, I think, or earlier. So there's some little story things, but none of them really seem that major. The other omission is, of course, Separate Ways. The DLC is not in the remake, but that may come later. And of course, there's the Mercenaries minigame. Did either of you guys play any Mercenaries?
I did not.
I didn't. Separate Way was the thing where you're playing as Ada?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I did play that originally on the GameCube, but I don't.
Yeah, that actually wasn't in the GameCube version.
Okay, well, I played it sometime.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't know
in
when I
every other
played it,
version
but
but the GameCube version.
yeah.
Um, that was one of those things that like the game originally came out on GameCube, and then when they ported it to PlayStation 2, it was one of those things where like, oh, they have to add something to it to make it like, I don't know. It's kind of a common thing in games when it gets ported to another system, they need extra content. Um, but yeah, I did end up playing Mercenaries. I thought it was pretty fun. I didn't get as deep into it as I did in the original, but I did play it enough to like get some good unlockables. Hunk is really hilarious to play as in the Mercenaries because if you stagger enemies, you can, and you go do a melee on them, it's an instant kill regardless of the enemy. So even if it's an elite enemy, like a chainsaw man or the minigun people or a summoner or whatever, it doesn't matter what enemy. I don't know if summoners are mercenaries, but it literally doesn't matter what enemy it is. If you stagger them and do a melee, they're dead with Hunk. Which is pretty good.
Heavy boy.
Yeah, so before we turn to I guess one other thing I'll say, sorry, I could talk about like weird differences forever. There is a part of me who misses the complete, just wild shit Leon says in the original. He is such a goofball in the original, and the remake is probably a better written game, but
But is that really what you want?
Is that really what you want with Resident Evil? I'm not sure. So I'll just give a shout out to OG Resident Evil 4 Leon for being just the weirdest guy.
Yeah, just being a weird dude.
I mean, he still has some weird lines in the remake. You know, they did keep some of his lines, but he's definitely a little more self-serious in the remake. All right. Well, I think we'll if nobody else has anything else to add, we'll wrap up with some final thoughts here. Nate, your mic is unmuted, so do you want to give us your final thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have like strong thoughts on this game. Like,
did you like it overall?
Yes, I enjoyed it. This is definitely a game that I enjoyed. Played through it, didn't feel fatigued, felt well paced. Got to the end, saw credits, thumbs up, good time, and then it kind of is one of those things that I just haven't thought a lot about it since I finished it. So it's one of those. It's a good game.
Fair. Yeah. One thing you said is well paced, and that is something I always think about for the original Resident Evil 4 of like one of the things that makes it one of my favorite games is very much just like it's kind of big set piece one after another that are all very unique and distinct and well designed, and it's just constant one after another. Like it doesn't feel, to me at least, doesn't feel that all that repetitive. Like each encounter feels at least a little bit different. And I think the remake, mostly has that effect as well. Like they do a good job of just like with their pacing and mixing things up a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
What about you, Will? What are your final overall thoughts for this remake?
Well, I guess just like, it's hard for you to, I don't know. I think you mentioned it's kind of hard for you sometimes to kind of figure out where you land in terms of the original Resident Evil and this one. I think I'm the only one of the three of us who played the Dead Space remake that came out this year as well.
No, I played it.
Oh, you played it? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess I can't help but like kind of compare RE4 a little bit unfavorably to that. And I know they're not the same, they're definitely not the same thing, but RE4 I think I enjoyed the environments. I enjoyed some of the set pieces and some of the encounters, but a lot of the times I was just kind of like, oh God, here we go again. And then they just throw some enormous pile of dudes at me and they'd all start walking at me kind of slow. And then they have this sort of staccato thing where like one of them will take like a step forward and then the other one will charge at you with like a fork or whatever, a trident, and
a pitchfork.
There we go. That's the word. You know, a fork trident. A fork trident.
All these farmers with their tridents.
Yes. trying to control the seas, you know what I mean? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd say overall I don't regret playing it, and I guess I probably overall had a positive impression of it, but it's certainly not a strong one. You know, I don't think it's going to make the GOTY list, so to speak, you know, for me. But it wasn't a bad thing to kind of revisit because it had been forever since I actually played the original. So, you know, I had forgotten certain pieces of it, and it was interesting to kind of see how they tried to kind of update it for the modern audience, so to speak.
Yeah. As for me, yeah, I did enjoy it overall. I don't know if I've come off more negative. But yeah, I did enjoy it overall. I actually do really appreciate that they did try to make it a different game. It's not, you know, Will mentioned the Dead Space remake, and I really enjoyed the Dead Space remake as well. But that is also a much more faithful remake. Like, that is, the changes they made were more of just like ironing out some kinks to make it more modern. I do appreciate that Resident Evil 4 remake took more ambitious liberties, I guess, to make it feel like a different game. Because, in my opinion, I think the original Resident Evil 4 is still pretty playable today. I mean, I think the original Dead Space is too. But so it was nice to see the changes, and I did enjoy it overall. I actually ended up playing through this remake, RE4 remake, like 3 times, I think. I went on New Game Plus and ramped up to professional difficulty with the Infinite Rocket Launcher, and like, I don't know, did other goofy New Game Plus stuff, and then did the Mercenaries mode. So I mean, I spent a good chunk of time with this game, and I did it because I liked it. I definitely struggle with comparing it to Resident Evil 4, and I know that's like my particular comparing to the original, because Resident Evil 4 is like one of the 3 games or so that I just like, I'm like just super weird about, because it's like such a near and dear favorite. And I don't like the remake as much as the original. It's like, this is how much I have like rose tinted glasses on for the originals when I like see reviews, which, you know, most of the reviews of the remake were like, oh, this is the definitive way to play Resident Evil now, and it completely, negates the original game or whatever, like it replaces it or whatever. And I'm just like, where I'm at is like, no, we're not going that far. But I do still like the remake a lot, and I think it stands. I think both of them can stand like together as like each their own game. I will always prefer the original, and I do think I have some gripes about the remake that are like things that don't quite work so well, especially with like the imprecise or unreliable staggers, and like the movement, which feels like they just kind of translated some RE2 mechanics into a different game, which doesn't quite work the same way. But still had a lot of fun with it. Still played it multiple times. Still might play it again at some point. Even if like the comparison to the original is a tricky one for me. They are both very good games in their own way. We'll put it that way.
Yep, that's fair.
And if no one else has any anything else to add here, that's going to be a podcast. And we have just discussed a whole lot of the Resident Evil 4 remake. Someday maybe we'll get a Resident Evil 5 remake. Who knows? That's going to do it for this podcast, though. I've been Flex, joined by Nate and Will, and this has been...
Wait, where's everybody going? Bingo?
Heyo! And on that note, ATACS is signing off. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast, and we will see you next time.